All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Sarah Jaffe. Sarah is an independent journalist whose work has been seen in Truth Out, Jacobin, The Nation, Alternate, and many more. She is also the co-host, along with Josh Idelson, of the great new podcast Belabored, all of which and more you can find at adifferentclass.com. You can also find her on Twitter at Sarah L. Jaffe. Sarah, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
So, Sarah, you have a great new piece currently up at American Prospect on how a local union in Oregon has a really great idea of how we can actually drive up wages and living conditions. Tell us all about it.
So, normally, let me back up a little bit. So we've seen since the financial crisis, and especially since the 2010 Republican takeover of a lot of state legislatures, public workers being blamed for the budget crises, right?
So which is obviously their fault. It's clearly all their fault.
So we hear things like, oh, well, we've got to cut their pensions because there just isn't enough money to go around and blah, blah, blah. And, we know that the reason there isn't enough money to go around is because we had a colossal recession and because tax revenues went down because people weren't working, that, the value of your house went through the floor. We know where the real problem came from. But people like Scott Walker and John Kasich, took the scapegoating of public workers to the point of trying to take away their right to collective bargaining. So this has been the sort of bait and switch that the Republicans and plenty of Democrats, too, have played on us since the financial crisis, right? It's like, oh, no, look over there at these people who make, $10 an hour and haven't had a raise in 6 years, but they're greedy. They're just not sharing their part of the shared sacrifice with Jamie Dimon, who I forget. Actually, Jamie Dimon did get a pay cut recently, but yeah, let's just leave that one alone. So in Oregon, there are something like 55,000 public workers of various types. About half of them are home care workers who provide state-funded care for people with disabilities or the elderly in their homes. And the other half are various, child welfare workers, workers at the university, people who do highway maintenance, all sorts of things. But they're all public sector employees, and they're all organized with SEIU Local 503. And so right now, about 48,000 of those workers are all in collective bargaining with the state about their various contracts. So as I mentioned, the home care workers haven't had a raise since 2007. They make $10.20 an hour, I believe, $10 and some change an hour. And, in other cases, there have been budget cuts at the university. There have been budget cuts in the child welfare workers. Two of them are doing the work of three because they just are so crunched. And right now, the governor and the state legislature, after the state legislature killed a plan to raise taxes on the rich and on corporations, they're talking about going after their pensions. And so they, understandably, considering that some of them haven't had a raise in 6 years, don't want this to be taken out of their pensions, too.
Yeah.
And so they are looking at where the money actually went, right? Because the money actually went to the banks. The money actually went out of the state's coffers because there was this massive financial crisis, which was largely caused by the banks doing things they shouldn't have been doing. And so what they did is they did a study. They looked at specifically the rigging of LIBOR, which I can explain in more detail if you have not covered that in much detail before.
We have, but do it again just in case people aren't familiar with it. It's always good to remember how horrible LIBOR is. So go ahead.
Right. So LIBOR is an interbank interest rate off of which lots and lots of other interest rates are set. One of them being rates by which municipalities borrow money. And the big banks, including J.P. Morgan and Bank of America, were rigging this interest rate because it's actually calculated by asking the banks what rate they could borrow at. So they were systematically rigging this interest rate to benefit themselves, which meant that the interest rate that cities and municipalities were borrowing at or paying back loans at or whatever was not what it should have been. Some cases it was lower, some cases it was higher. This particular local has calculated that Oregon's loss to LIBOR rigging alone was like $110 million. That's $110 million that could be used to, I don't know, pay for things like teachers, child welfare workers, home care workers to take care of your grandmother so that you can stay at your full-time job. Right, that these are public service workers who do services that most people rely on or will rely on at some point. And so then in addition to that, there's all sorts of other, we know about all sorts of other financial issues that were caused by the banks. A lot of the time, banks would essentially convince cities, states that needed to borrow money, that needed to finance something, that, you should do that using some complicated derivative and just don't worry about it. We're your buddies. We will get, we'll get you a good deal and we'll make sure whatever. And Wallace Turbeville, who I spoke to for this story, who is now a fellow at Demos but used to be at Goldman Sachs doing these kinds of deals, estimated that it's about 10 to 1 more expensive to do any of this, any fairly straightforward financial transaction. Doing it through derivatives makes the bank 10 times more money off of your tax dollars.
Yeah.
So this union has brought forward, they're not just sort of putting out a report and having some protests, but they're actually bringing these issues up in collective bargaining. And they're saying, no, we're not going to give in and allow you to cut our pensions. We're going to say that you need to get this money back from the banks instead. We're going to give in.
They're actually proposing, through their collective bargaining, they're saying, wait a second, you need to sue these big banks, and actually saying that as part of their bargaining, they're saying, you know what, the money is there, all you need to do is go after these banks, and then we will have this money to pay for our pensions, to pay for our workers, to pay for, to not have to cut actual pay and cut jobs. You can actually sue these banks for the crimes that they committed, and if you get this money, ta-da, we have the money to run our society, essentially.
Right, exactly. And this is sort of a next step forward for a union to actually be including these issues in their collective bargaining. We saw sort of similar thinking around the Chicago teachers' strike, right? But in Chicago, they were legally limited, and this was a decision that was made shortly before the strike to legally limit their ability to bargain to wages and working conditions. But they nevertheless managed to make, their working conditions are the students' learning conditions, right? This is something that they have said, something that the Moore Caucus here in New York within the UFT has said. And they really made those conditions a part of their struggle and made sure that the public knew about that. And they got a lot of public support, right? And Heather Conroy, who's the executive director of Local 503 in Oregon, she said, this is the same question. If we want people to stand up for our right to collective bargaining, like the people in Ohio stood up for the public workers' right to collective bargaining, she's like, we have to make sure that collective bargaining is working for them too, that it's actually doing good for everyone in the state and not just for the union members, right? That we don't allow them to pit union members against people who don't have a union on their job. And that we really say, look, when we do better, you all do better. Not just because we're there and we're able to provide good public services and we don't have child welfare workers, having things slip through the cracks because they're totally understaffed, but also that if we get this money back for the state, we actually have an opportunity to refund things that haven't been funded for years. And we also have an opportunity to talk about how we should finance things in the future, right? That we shouldn't fund them by letting banks con us into shady deals in order to pay for things. That there has to be a better way to do this other than getting scammed.